This is apropos. After abandoning EU membership talks in 2013, Iceland is gearing up to hold a referendum on joining the bloc, potentially as soon as August. Repeated threats by Donald Trump to annex Greenland, which is located between Iceland and the US, have made the question of EU membership more pressing. Well, for more on the view from Brussels, let's bring in France 24 correspondent Dave Keating. Dave, let's start with what the EU view is of this referendum. Are there benefits for Brussels in having Iceland become a member of the bloc?
There would be benefits. I mean, I think the important context to know here is it actually wouldn't change very much because Iceland is already basically a member of the European Union. Back in the 1990s, both Norway and Iceland had referendums in which the population voted against joining the European Union, but the politicians there decided that it just wasn't realistic for them to be outside the EU when every other country in Europe was joining, and so they created this thing called the European Economic Area. That has basically recreated European Union membership, but without the voting rights. So Iceland already has to follow almost all areas of EU law, with the notable exception of some fisheries laws. But Iceland doesn't get a vote in the EU. That's the system they've had since the 1990s, along with Norway. Critics of the system often call it a fax democracy because Iceland is told what rules it has to follow by Brussels, but it doesn't have a vote. Doesn't have seats here in the European Council, in the European Parliament. So it really wouldn't change much for the EU, but for Iceland, it would give some guarantees, and it would also give more certainty. We're referring there to some of the anxiety that Icelanders are feeling right now, given Donald Trump's threats to Greenland, the fact that he mistakenly referred to Iceland several times in his speech in Davos, and the fact that Trump's ambassador to Iceland joked last month that the U.S. would be taking on Iceland as the 52nd state after Greenland. Now, he insists he was only joking, but that didn't help calm fears in Iceland, and that's why they're moving ahead with this. I will say, though, there is some skepticism here in Brussels about this, because Iceland already applied to join the EU back in 2008. You may remember there was this Icelandic banking crisis with the IceSave Bank, when all the banks, or almost all the banks in Iceland, collapsed. There was a panic then by the government. They applied to join the EU, but by the time they got far along in the process, then we had the Eurozone crisis, and all of a sudden the EU wasn't looking that appealing to Iceland, so they actually abandoned those EU membership talks back in 2013. There is some concern here to say, okay, we don't want this yo-yo accession talks with Iceland on again, off again. They've said this already also with the UK, that if the UK were ever to apply for membership to rejoin the EU, they would need to know that a future government wouldn't come in and undo that. In other words, they would need to see an extremely high level of public support in the UK for rejoining the EU. So they want to see the same thing in Iceland, and they're not seeing it. Right now, it's about 50-50 in terms of polls about whether Icelanders want to join the European Union or not. Now, that may change in the height of a referendum once they get more information, once people really start thinking about this. But I have to say, people in Brussels aren't looking at those polls very favorably. I mean, these accession talks take up a lot of time and cost a lot of money. And in some view here, Iceland already wasted a lot of the EU's time back between 2008 and 2013 on this.
Dave, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining us, though. That's our correspondent, Dave Keating, joining us there with the view from Brussels. Well, let's bring in from Reykjavik, Eirikur Bergmann, Professor of Politics at Bifröst University. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. As we heard there from Dave, bit of scepticism in Brussels about the potential of Iceland making this move, holding this referendum. What do you say to that? What's your view when it comes to perhaps Brussels not looking very, very favourably at this potential referendum?
Well, Iceland has always remained pretty undecided when it comes to the European Union. Iceland has the same need as everybody else in Europe to belong to the single market, trade freely and be sort of within the same zone. But Iceland has always guarded its independence also very fiercely, and the idea of sovereignty is very strong. So Icelanders simply have remained undecided, but there are still some new elements now coming into play. Well, we have a new government which has a different kind of approach than the previous ones. But in addition, the security aspects of the situation is a new part of the debate, and that might change things for Icelanders.
And all of this, of course, actually predates Donald Trump's return to the White House. Iceland has been strengthening its ties with the EU in recent years. Just talk to us a little bit about that. You know, it's not prompted wholly by what's been happening at the White House.
No, I mean, this coalition came in prior to the second term of Donald Trump, and that coalition decided in its agreement that they would put the referendum question of whether to resume the negotiations that were halted in 2013. So that was not as a response to Donald Trump, but the security aspect and the sort of conflict or the dilemma over Greenland has sort of enhanced the urgency amongst some people in Iceland. But it is true that a large swaths of the population remain pretty hesitant.
And is that why we're seeing so much diplomatic activity then? You know, this announcement, it comes after a flurry of visits by EU politicians to Iceland and vice versa.
Well, I mean, Iceland would be an asset for the European Union, pretty clearly. It would be the first time in more than 3 decades that a net contributor would join the European Union. Iceland is pretty trouble-free when it comes to sort of upholding the requirements of membership, a functioning democracy, a liberal democracy with a strong economy. So Iceland doesn't bring a lot of baggage with it, apart from its sort of staunch independence stance. So I think from the viewpoint of Brussels, Iceland should be an easy assimilation, and negotiations, they would revolve around fisheries. That would be the main stumbling block. And given a solution on that, the rest should be pretty an easy transition for Iceland into the EU. But again, it is probably a conundrum for the EU to try to wrap its head around whether Iceland really means it this time around. And I understand that that this question is being raised. That's a very valid question.
And Iceland, it's already a founding member of NATO. It's already part of the EU single market, the Schengen open border travel zone, the European Free Trade Association. As Dave Keating said a little earlier, it's kind of more or less already within the EU. So does it really need to become a fully integrated member?
No, I mean, and that has kept Iceland outside of the European Union, that it doesn't actually need it in economic terms to fully join the European Union to sort of enjoy the benefits of the single market, of the research cooperation. For example, I participate and my colleagues in fully without friction in European academic cooperation. Travel is catered for within Schengen. So there is not a real economic sort of urgency. The main benefit for Iceland in economic terms would be to adopt the euro as well. The Icelandic currency brings a bit of economical problems. We have prolonged higher interest rates than almost anywhere else. Inflation remains very stubborn, and it's very difficult to bring that down. So many people see benefits in the euro there. But you're absolutely right. For most economic purposes, Iceland is already within the realms of the European Union. It's just a question of whether Iceland should take the final step and actually join the union fully. And many people say simply admit the reality that Iceland is already almost a de facto member of the European Union through all its association programs.
And we don't have a date yet for the referendum. When do you think it's likely to take place? And if people do vote to join the EU, what happens next?
Yes, a lot of the international reporting on the dates have been, well, not very well founded. The proposal has not been put forward to the parliament. At the very earliest, it could be August, but I would predict that the debate in parliament will drag on until spring. And so we might see a referendum in late autumn or early next year. And it will also be a double referendum. If Icelanders accept to resume the talks in this pre-referendum that will be held soon, that will be subject to a confirming referendum after the accession treaty has been negotiated and prior to Iceland becoming member of the EU. So this is still a very long process, but that's also a bit of a problem. We saw that last time, as when the process of accession negotiation drags on for a long time, the population becomes increasingly hesitant. It doesn't really help to sort of rally support to drag the process very far. So that is another aspect to take into consideration.
Eirikur, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us, though, on the programme. That's Eirikur Bergmann, Professor of Politics at Bifröst University in Reykjavik. Well, that's it.